So I usually don't do debates. But the problem is that, which is not a problem, is that we agree. So
Up until now, we have agreed, yes.
up until now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we usually agree, we talk to each other. We didn't talk about this, we didn't prepare for this debate, unlike politicians, right?
Which for me, the first time, by the way, in my life that I didn't prepare for being on stage. Academic culture kind of makes you always, very stressed, and I always come with the slides and, that my ego prepares to impress everybody. So it's a kind of a first for me, in a way. And so he was talking about how contagious fearlessness is, so we'll see,
I mean, he's a mathematics professor. He's used to speak to his students.
Yes.
So we have a debate, no debate between a professional mathematician and scientist with an interest in non-duality and a non-duality teacher with a background in science. So, and since the theme is science and non-duality, I mean,
yes.
we could go at it, right?
Right.
And I guess, you may have questions that will make things easy for us.
Right. But in fact, there was one question earlier,
Okay.
right, about the relationship between science and non-duality. What a great question, because we are here, obviously, at the conference called Science and Non Duality. And so I think that, well, Francis already partially answered that, but I want to kind of contribute a little bit. I think that we are at a very interesting time. It used to be, I think, that most of the people who were truly interested in spiritual journeys, learning the truth of who they are, were people who were not necessarily with scientific background. And there are various reasons for that. It's not by chance. And I can speak about my own, path, if you will. My own and my sort of experience and insight as to why it is like that. The short of it is, I chose mathematics as a way to insulate myself from the real world, to find a place where I was safe from the from the difficulties that I was facing. So it was not by chance, because science, mathematics especially, gives you this very precise, this pure domain where you cannot be touched by, by bullies and bigots and so on. But the fact remains, there are very few. Although one notable exception, I would say, was David Bohm. And there are famous dialogues, not drawing any parallels. Famous dialogues between David Bohm and Krishnamurti, which actually played a big role for me. And I know that Krishnamurti played a role on your path. Perhaps you will tell us a little bit about this. So that's one notable exception. And I think that it's there's a book and there's these dialogues, which I think are fascinating. And so, but the bottom line is, I think very few scientifically minded people were embarking on this kind of journey, which probably more for people with more artistic, kind of right side of the brain kind of people, rather than left side. But I think it's changing now, and the reason is that technology and science are invading our lives and really determining sort of where we're going as a species now, more than ever before. And we scientists have to keep up. We have to become more aware. We have to become more, interested in the question of who we are. And that brings certain challenges, I think, to the sort of spiritual community. How do you communicate with somebody who is scientifically minded? And that, I am a kind of a prime example of this. And Maurizio is right. When I was first invited to speak here, which was about close to 3 years ago, at that time, I was like, non-duality, what is this new agey stuff, So I was concerned how this would be reflected on my reputation, who was concerned, obviously. So, and and so then somebody like me, very rigorous, trained to think very rigorously, requires a very special regimen of, teaching, of a particular teaching, very rigorous, very precise, because I can spot logical inconsistencies very easily. And if I do, my mind checks out and says, this is bullshit, okay? It doesn't work. So you have to be very careful with people like me to teach us something that we can then take and absorb and process. But if we do, if we sort of take the bait in some sense, then we can use that mind, which is after all a tool. It is a tool. And it's very, it's trained, it's honed to be precise. We can use it as a sort of almost like a diamond to cut through a lot of things very quickly. And by itself is not enough, but it can take us to, as it is beautifully said here, to the edge of the unknown. So for me, what's interesting to discuss today is precisely that. How do we communicate? So, and in this respect, the teachings of Francis have been incredibly powerful to me. His teachings also, Jean Klein's teachings, who was his teacher, in that they were so precise that my mind would be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Let's take the next one. Take the next one. Well, I guess I'm speaking for too long, but that's sort of. Now, his background is in science. So Francis went to the esteemed École Polytechnique in France and was trained as a scientist. So I am curious, maybe would you share maybe just a little bit about how that happened for you, that you became interested in the truth?
I had problems being in public or being with people, especially if they were of the opposite gender, especially if they were young, especially if they were beautiful. I was in my 20s, right? So I decided that I was screwed, which I was. And I was trying to get out of this predicament. One day I was making a stop in Paris in the Latin Quarter, and I went to this bookstore. In the psychology display of the books, there was a book. On the spine, there was Krishnamurti. It was the 60s, so for those who are old enough to remember, the Beatles, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the hippies. I had experience with pot. So Krishnamurti was in line with this kind of an Indian name, so I picked the book, and that was the beginning. That's how.
It's beautiful, isn't it? So,
and I must say that upon reading the book, I understood that my self-consciousness or my shyness had its origin somewhere else, in my identification with my little person. And that even whatever I would try to address this specific issue I had wouldn't liberate me from the full enchilada of my problems. That I better try to solve everything once and for all, which I tried to do over the following years. And I met my teacher, etc. And without trying to do anything about my shyness, and only to realize a few years later that 90% of my problem had vanished without me doing anything to that end. So that was great. In other words, the mother of all problems is this sense or this belief to be a separate person. When you address that, all the other psychological issues then will eventually collapse. That was my experience. As you can see, I'm not very much intimidated by you guys now.
There is one detail which you mentioned to me when we talked about this before, which is that bookstore in Paris, where you bought the book, you told me that you actually passed by the building many times, but you didn't know that.
That was a different bookstore.
It was a different bookstore.
In the same area, but in a different street.
So sometimes the bookstore manifests itself when we are ready for it, right? And the book manifests itself when we are ready. And then there is this beautiful moment when you realize that you read a book. And for me personally, books have been, that has been my sort of livelihood, and my channel. But it was a kind of a special moment when I realized that, my God, it's not just somebody wrote that book and it was frozen, for many years, and now I'm opening and I'm looking at those symbols. It's a collaborative process that's happening. It's magic, some mystery is happening. And so that's the question is, how do we capture? So, for instance, I have to say, I discovered actually Francis last year at SAND. He gave a beautiful Q&A here, just as he did today. So again, I guess I was ready to discover a year ago. And one of the things, so just to give an example of a kind of thing that resonated with me, and which kind of, I was like, that's how I can understand it. There is always this discussion about I, and there's such a great confusion. And the problem is that it's so deeply entrenched, the identification. When I say I, that I'm thinking, Edward Frenkel, this guy who is in this body, sitting in this chair. So then, of course, it becomes problematic. How come they say I am God? I don't feel like I am God, right? So it's strange. But then I heard something else. He said, you have to distinguish that from that which is aware, that which is hearing his words or my words right now. And so that's one example of this. This is kind of a scientific approach. So you kind of like separate these two things. So you realize, so the eye is not so the eye is in the eye of the beholder, kind of, right? So it depends on what is the definition, as Bill Clinton used to say, what the definition of is, so. So what the definition of I is. And when I understood, when I grasped, I was like, so when they say I, they don't mean I as Edward Frenkel. It's this I which is aware, which is hearing, which is listening, which is watching, right? And so then things became much more, started to make sense, right? So that's an example of a scientific, of a kind of a way of speaking which is more aligned with the logical mind of a scientist.
Yes.
I mean, for me, it's still fresh in my mind because it was only a year ago. I was like, oh my God, that's what it is. So here's another one. Then I'm reading.
He has the enthusiasm of a new convert.
I'm serious. I'm like a dog who learned these new tricks and he wants to show off, right? So, but then, for instance, I'm reading his books and the books of John Klein, and they talk about this, how our true nature actually shines between thoughts and, in deep sleep and so on. I was like, I'm not experiencing anything in my deep sleep. I don't remember anything. What does it mean between two thoughts also? And especially for mathematicians, thoughts come at such a high speed that the gaps are very short. And then he explained to me, he said, actually, every time you understand something, you realize something, it is your true nature. You are your true nature, stripped off of all the layers of spurious layers. And that was also a revelation. I was like, oh my God! So it's not something, I speak, it's like Molière, I speak prose, so I am the true nature at this moment when I realized something, when I understood something. And that's where mathematician, he said, well, when you prove a theorem, there is this moment, you're proving one, you infer one statement from another, and the proof is ended. At that moment, there is something. Well, there you are. And it's like, oh, it's so simple, So that's the kind of thing that would resonate. So when we talk about, going back to the question earlier, that science and non-duality, that's where scientific training actually could work in our favor, shall I say. But then the next task is to understand that it can only take you so far. So, do you have any comment on this? So, for me, it was the biggest struggle of my life is to accept that ultimately there is no theory. There is no ultimate theory. Or they say, in science we have theory of everything. And everybody has their competing theory of everything because, of course, it's my theory. Me, the ego, I have learned all this stuff. I am going to teach the world of everything, right? So there is this almost reflex. And so, is there a pill for this, doctor?
Is that what?
Is there a is there a pill? There is medicine. Is there a medicine for this?
I think when you said you can only go so far, well, we should respect this understanding because, as I said earlier, whenever we understand something about consciousness, whenever we truly understand, it's never intellectual. Intellectual understanding is not real understanding, is simply relate something to something else. We remain in the mind. It's not experiential. But when we understand something about consciousness, we understand it experientially through the experience of consciousness. So that's very important, not to diminish in our own eyes our understanding about the truth, about non-duality. It's very important. Then whatever we have understood, then we have to apply it. Because what we understand is a possibility. It's a possibility that consciousness be universal instead of being limited and human-based as we previously thought. But then we have to try to conduct experiments to verify or falsify this, using a scientific language, to verify or falsify this hypothesis. And it is then in this process of trying to live our life in accordance with this new perspective, then we'll get convinced that it is true and that our lives will change. We cannot, otherwise my teacher used to say, if we don't try to apply it in our life, it's like having a beautiful car and remaining in the garage, not driving your Porsche or your Ferrari out on the roads. And so that's the comment I would make. It takes you very far, in fact,
yes,
up to the extreme.
Yes.
But then you have to trust it.
You have to trust. At some point,
And then you have to live it.
It's trust. But of course, the whole point is for somebody, for a brainiac like myself, that's the most difficult thing to do, to trust, right? Because that's why I went into science to begin with, because I didn't have to take anything on trust. I could prove things in mathematics, right? So that's where the leap has to happen. And so, but in a sense also, when I first, when Francis very generously agreed to talk to me a few months, 6 months ago or so, I was so full of questions, and interestingly enough, I knew that these questions are not really going to give me the answer. I knew it, but I couldn't help myself. I have to ask. He says consciousness is universal. There's one consciousness which is hearing these words, which is what I am often mistakenly, identifying as my own, right? But then, so is everyone else's is the same one, he says. And I'm like, how is it possible? How come I know my thoughts, but I don't know his thoughts? And then it goes on and on and on in circles. But the beauty of a teacher like Francis is that he would say, it's okay. You should ask the questions. If the question arises,
Yeah.
speak it. Say the question. Don't suppress. That's the worst. And so it's interesting how, in a way, we all we come to the end of the line when we kind of get exhausted, I think.
Yeah. Mathematicians have a lot of questions.
It's hard to exhaust me, but it's possible. So
I remember one day I started asking questions at breakfast with my teacher. We had breakfast together, and then around 11 o'clock he decides, okay, let's drive to Cannes. Let's have a nice lunch at the restaurant. So we drove. During the drive, 1 hour, one drive, I kept asking questions. Then during the meal, asking questions. We were in this fancy restaurant in Cannes. It was during the festival. And there were all these movie producers, actors, actresses around us, smoking big cigars, big shot talking about business, etc. And all this greed and ego, it was charged. And we were like in a bubble of peace, like you are in an aquarium, watching the fish, outside. It's already funny. But I was still asking questions. And then after the lunch, we went to the La Croisette, the street in front of the beach. And my teacher, he was kind of tried to distract my attention, and there were boats outside of some foreign navies, and we saw sailors coming up to us, and my teacher talked to them, which nations are you from? Are those your ships? But then I kept asking questions. Then after the meal, we needed to go to the loo, and so we went downstairs. I remember being side by side on the loo and still asking questions. So mathematicians are sticky with questions. He's not a desperate case, the way I used to be.
Thank you.
He's reasonable.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think sometimes I would be very, very pestering you with questions and so on. But I do see that it was necessary. It was. And I think that it's a good moment maybe to see if anybody has questions. Okay, well, Francis, you ran the
time
show.
to be serious also about science and non-duality.
Yeah. That's why I'm wearing a jacket, by the way, so. We need microphones, I suppose.
It's actually your question, but it wasn't answered about the pill without sharing this world.
Share the world.
Question.
Yes,
Answer.
it was already answered. Go ahead.
I just want to ask if you can answer a question about the pill that would, when you learn something and you're so passionate about it, you feel like the whole mystery was open to you and you want to share this point of view with the whole world. What's the cure for that, if that desire of that ego to be predominant? How do you...
But why do you say it's the ego's desire?
Yes, how do you, if you work on lowering your ego or trying to diminish it, how do you do it?
I'm not getting your question. Can you rephrase it?
From my experience, ego is a stand on the way of a lot of things in my life. Because with a lot of realizations that I had, after that, my ego takes over and kind of almost like puts bad, not bad, just diminishing it because it wants to thrive in this knowledge. How do you work with your ego? How do you make it so your motives are not based on your ego? Your motives are pure, and you're pure.
My ego wants to answer this. But,
Please.
yeah? Okay. It's something which fresh in my mind. So.
You take responsibility.
So, no, but see how my ego jumped, right? So that's a good one. And so he explained this to me actually, and I love this answer. So how do you separate? Because we should not think that every time we want to share and explain and so on, that it comes from the ego. No, not at all. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it comes from the truth. It comes from through nature. And that's what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to share. We are supposed to help each other. So how to distinguish between the two? That is the question. And the answer is? Huh?
Not distinguish, but when you even distinguish, do you have your own way how you practice of removing ego from your, if you practice,
so
of course.
He would say, okay, again, the ego jobs.
Thank you.
Ego is not the problem. The problem is identification with the ego, right? Yes. do I pass? I pass? See, because for me it was the same question. I thought I had to kill the ego. But what is this instinct to kill something? You don't have to kill anything. Just let it be. Dangling here, this ego, there is this Edward Frenkel, who is this best-selling author and like whatever, professor of Berkeley. It's okay, it's not a problem, but I know it's not me, you know, so, or it's a small part of me, let's just say, right? So when you realize that you don't have to kill, but only watch the mechanism of your identification with it, it's a totally different game. I hope it came across as earnest as it was meant, you know.
There are more questions. We need to make
Yes.
a little bit room for everybody.
Yes.
Behind you, yes.
Hear me? Oh, great. So I do not remember the author of the following quote, so if you do, please remind me. And I believe that a scientist and mathematician at some point said that mathematics is the language of nature.
Yes.
So
Galileo.
I'm sorry?
Galileo.
Galileo, thank you. Well, fellow Italian, I should have...
Laws of nature are written in language of mathematics.
Okay, great. So now for you, now that you're becoming, or seems to be becoming more aware of your own true nature, is there any interest as a mathematician, as a scientist, to prove that with a mathematical equation?
To do what?
To prove it with a mathematical equation. And for you, Francis, the language of nature, I sense it as being. Would you say anything as to what is the language of true nature? I meant to say true nature. So I don't know who wants to go first of the two.
You go first.
Well, the language of our true nature is a silent presence that perceives all things, that never says no, that welcomes all appearances. So it's a silent, loving, all-welcoming presence, that which is hearing these words. But about mathematics being the language of nature, that's a very old thing. I think it's Heraclitus who says, "Otheos ae geometrai," means the gods always geometrizes. There is this uncanny correspondence between the discovery of modern physics theories in physics and parallel discoveries in mathematics. Like I have I have succulents in my garden. And it's very strange that when one flowers, the other flowers, like they signal to each other that they have to give the flowers at the same moment. They are distant, they are seemingly unrelated, but they kind of conspire to get in bloom on the same year at the same time. So the same thing in physics and mathematics. We had, Fourier coming up with the Fourier transform, or Hilbert with the Hilbert space, and then it applies to all kinds of fields in mathematics, quantum mechanics, etc. Riemann with his theory of curved space, etc., and then Einstein and general relativity theory. And there is something almost miraculous there. It has not escaped. Who was the physicist who underlined that, a famous physicist?
Dirac?
It was Dirac? I don't remember. But there is this beauty. Also, talking about Dirac, he came up with this equation. And Dirac was, for him, mathematics belonged to a different realm, to kind of a realm of Platonician realm of ideas. And so his equation had two kinds of solution. One with positive energy about the electron, and one with negative energy which didn't make sense physically. And from this, but for Dirac, the fact that there were these two kinds of solution, and the beauty and the symmetries of the equation, he says, there must be God, through the mathematics, through these beauties, through these symmetries, must be telling us something. And he came up with the interpretation of the positron, the anti-electron, which would have a positive charge, the anti-particle. That was the beginning, the discovery of antimatter. 2 or 3 years later, the positron was experientially verified, was discovered experientially. So that is extraordinary thing, that from the beauty and the symmetries of one equation, we can discover new things about nature. And besides the beauty of the discovery in pure mathematics of a new theorem, of a new theory, this kind of interrelation between the two fields tells us something very deep, for the following reason, that mathematics, they are only mind stuff. You see, they are apparently unrelated to matter. You see, they are the product of discovering from within the human mind, whereas the phenomena that takes place in the world are matter-related. So a great question in philosophy is, where is the connection between the subtle realm of mathematical ideas and the physical realm of matter? But this uncanny harmony between mathematics and physics tells us about, hints at a higher truth where they both united, consciousness. So that on the one hand, through the mind, you have the mathematical theory. On the one hand, through nature, you have the natural phenomena. Going back to Heraclitus. You agree?
Yes. Definitely.
It's a personal question to Francis. So as a non-dualist, when you hear a question which is dualistic in nature, like about a personal God or saving the material world, do you consider these questions as doubts, counterpoints, questions that are rising in your own awareness? Or do you really think there's people are asking the questions?
When I hear a question, I listen to the question, and then I listen to the answer. And then I speak the answer. Very simple.
Me too.
Actually, that's how he solves his problem. See, he listens to the problem, and then he listens to the solution. Then he writes his paper, right?
Totally.
May take some time.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be fun. If it were too easy, it wouldn't be fun, right?
So Edward, after your moving out to the non-dual world, my nephew is my nephew is studying in UC Berkeley. So let's say he takes your class and he doesn't turn in your homework.
Okay.
Do you consider that as something that is in your own awareness, or do you give a F to him?
It reminds me of Francis sometimes gives this example that if you are speeding on the highway and a policeman stops you, you don't tell the policeman, I'm God, so you cannot give me a ticket. Because then he will charge you probably twice as much.
Yeah, and you may spend your weekend in weird places.
So my students had better not use that argument, either. So, but when we speak about the teaching, for instance, one of the things I realized also, talking to Francis, is how communication, mutual understanding, if you think about it, it would not be possible just by sort of like mechanical transmission alone. There is something going on, which is, reminds me of this Arthur Eddington, something unknown is doing, we don't know what. And Arthur Eddington, a very famous astronomer who confirmed Einstein's general relativity and so on, he spoke about Heisenberg's uncertainty, but I think it applies, for instance, to comprehension. For instance, you ask me a question, how come I understood the question, right? So, and how come you understand my answer? Interestingly enough, my my daytime job as a professor at UC Berkeley gives me certain experience, valuable experience in seeing that. And I do feel this, sometimes I teach a class of 500 students. And I used to think that, mathematics, okay, so it's very rigorous stuff, so there is no spiritual content in it. But now I think there is, and I feel that sometimes, I feel it in the silence. So, of course, everybody always says silence is God's language and silent presence and so on. But it sounds sometimes too abstract. But here's a very concrete example of silence. When I speak to my students, and there are these moments when they got it all at once. And there is this moment of precious silence, which is more silent than just the silence of no one speaking. And that's when I know that we are on the same page.
There is something beautiful when we agree, and that's why people seek this agreement. Look, in Rupert's country, where the weather is awful, and it's like rainy, 0 degrees, and they go to each other. Lovely weather, isn't it? Oh, indeed, invigorating. They agree with each other, it's beautiful, just about ordinary things, like their weather. I have a question about. We are out of time.
But time doesn't exist.